Following the end of the Second World War, the German capital of Berlin was divided into Allied control regions, with the British, the Americans, and the French dividing West Berlin between them, and the Soviets controlling East Berlin. As time progressed, relations between the East and the West began to deteriorate as the Cold War got into full swing. In the 1960s, the Soviets cut off access to East Berlin via the construction of a large wall dividing the capital with a no-man's zone policed by the military. The wall came up overnight on 13th of August 1961 and left thousands cut off from friends and family for decades. However, tension had been building before that, and this wasn't the first conflict between East and West Berlin. On 24th of June 1948, the Berlin Blockade began. This blockade was caused by the Soviets, who blocked the Western Allies' trade route access, meaning the West were unable to send goods to their people by rail, road or canal. The Soviets demanded that the West remove the newly introduced Deutschmark in favour of the Eastern Deutschmark, which was also known as the Ostmark. The Berlin Blockade was one of the very first crises of the Cold War. Rail, road and canal routes into the city were blocked, and this left only one solution: air. A coalition of air forces including the US Air Force, Britain's Royal Air Force, the French Air Force, the Canadian Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force, the Royal New Zealand Air Force and the South African Air Force combined to drop care packages to the people of Berlin. These packages contained everything that they would need to survive: food and fuel. The Soviets did not intervene or attempt to shoot down any of the Allied planes for fear of causing war between both sides. The day the Soviets began the blockade, West Berlin had enough food to feed their population for 36 days, and enough coal to last them 45 days. It was clear that the Allies would need to act fast. US Commander General Clay approached the British Air Force Commander Sir Brian Robertson to begin an airlift, only to find out that the British had already set one up and were airlifting aid to British troops stuck inside Berlin. The Royal Air Force had already been dropping a sizable chunk of goods before the joint expedition began, but those numbers would have to increase drastically if they were to support the entire city. The US calculated that to support the city with a daily ration of 1900 calories, it'd need to deliver daily supplies of 646 tons of flour and wheat, 125 tons of cereal, 64 tons of fat, 109 tons of meat and fish, 180 tons of dehydrated potatoes, 180 tons of sugar, 11 tons of coffee, 19 tons of powdered milk, 5 tons of whole milk for children, 3 tons of fresh yeast for baking, 144 tons of dehydrated vegetables, 38 tons of salt, and 10 tons of cheese. In all, 1,534 tons were required each day to sustain the over 2 million people of Berlin. Also for heat and power, 3,475 tons of coal, diesel and petrol were required daily. Due to post-war shrinkage of the militaries, both sides scrambled to get enough aircraft to deliver the massive number of goods needed by the people of Berlin. On the 25th of June 1948, General Clay gave the order to launch Operation Vittles, the name the airlift was given. The following day, 32 C-47s lifted off for Berlin, hauling 80 tons of cargo, including milk, flour and medicine. The first British aircraft flew on 28th of June. At that time, the airlift was expected to last 3 weeks. It would go on for over a year. Hundreds of planes were arriving in Berlin from neighbouring airports. The US flights would come in from Rhein-Main Air Base and Wiesbaden, while the British airports flew in from Hamburg. This caused a logistical nightmare to avoid crashes, and a complex system was created known as the block system. It involved 3 8-hour shifts of C-54s flying into Berlin, followed by a shift of C-47s. The airstrip was scheduled to see a plane take off every 4 minutes, and planes were expected to fly 1,000 feet higher than the plane in front. The airlift started off slow, delivering only 90 tons a day during its first week, but this would rise tenfold to 1,000 tons by the second week. 6 weeks into the operation, a new commander from the US camp would be sent to take over the airlift. Major General William H. Turner was embarrassed by the inadequacy of the setup and began to make major changes. This became known as Black Friday, and Turner noted it was from this date that the airlift really became a success. By the end of August 1948, a month after Turner's Black Friday changes, the airlift saw more than 1,500 flights a day and 4,500 tons of cargo delivered, which was enough to keep West Berlin supplied. By January of the following year, this improved to 5,000 tons a day. The Allies had refused to bow to the Soviets' demands and were keeping their people alive at all costs. One of the most notable stories to come from the Berlin airlift is that of the Candy Bomber. A US Air Force pilot named Gale Halvorson decided to use his off time from work to fly into Berlin and try to make movies using his handheld camera. On the 17th of July 1948, he arrived at Berlin Airport and was greeted by a large group of children. They were curious about the aircraft, and Gale took the time to answer all of their questions. He gave the children 2 packs of Wrigley's Double Mint gum and was so moved by the children's generosity and gratitude as they divided up the gum into the smallest pieces they could to provide everyone a piece, that he promised he'd return to drop off more. Before takeoff, one of the children asked him how they would know it was him. He replied that he'd wiggle his wings. The next day on his approach to Berlin, he wiggled his aircraft and dropped some chocolate bars attached to a handkerchief parachute to the children waiting down below. Each day, the crowd of awaiting children grew larger and larger. The US Air Force Base began receiving stacks of thank you mail addressed to Uncle Wiggly Wings, the Chocolate Uncle, and the Chocolate Flyer. Halvorson's commanding officer was upset when the story began to appear in the newspapers, but when Major General Tunner heard about it, he approved of the gesture and immediately expanded it into Operation Little Vittles. Other pilots joined in and began to drop their own care packages to the children of Berlin, and when news reached the US shores, children all over the country sent in their own candy to help out. Soon, major candy manufacturers joined in the effort and over 23 tons of candy were dropped on Berlin. Things carried on this way until the 15th of April 1949, when the Soviet news agency TASS announced a willingness for the end of the blockade. The 4 powers immediately began negotiating, and by 1 minute to midnight on the 12th of May 1949, the blockade was lifted. The first truck carrying supplies entered the city seconds later, and the first cargo train arrived at 5:32 a.m. The airlift didn't stop, as it was essential for the city to build up a comfortable surplus, should something similar happen again in the future. By the end of the airlift on the 30th of September 1949, a total of 2,326,406 tons of goods had been delivered by the airlift. 101 fatalities were recorded as a result of the operation, including 40 Brits and 31 Americans, mostly as a result of non-flying accidents. 1 Australian Air Force member was killed in an aircraft crash, as well as 17 Americans and 8 Brits had also lost their lives in crashes. The cost of the airlift, split between the US, the UK and Germany, was estimated to have been between $224 million and $500 million, which equates to $2.6 billion and $5.27 billion adjusted for inflation. However, the saviour of 2 million lives, as well as an early defeat for the Soviets in the Cold War, was well worth the cost of the taxpayer. Thanks for watching the video. I hope you enjoy this little slice of history. Again, it's something a bit different to the content most of you are here for, but it's something I enjoy making and will make more of. If you want to support me, then please do subscribe to the channel and ring the bell to be notified when I go live. If you want to support me financially, then I've set up a Patreon. I have grand plans for the channel with the eventual goal of doing this full time and increasing the quality of my videos, but both of these things cost money. So every dollar helps. I'll see you next time. Bye!